Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Ich heiße Sie herzlich willkommen zum ersten GVS-Finanzkongress, der unter dem Motto "Die Karten werden neu gemischt" steht. Willkommen. Mein Name ist Bachheimer und ich habe die Ehre und Freude, Sie heute durch den Tag zu geleiten. Und ich möchte zuerst einmal alle hier im Saal herzlich begrüßen, aber auch die Pressevertreter, die auch hier im Saal sind und auch virtuell zugeschaltet sind, sowie die Livestream-Kunden, die diesen Kongress gemütlich ohne Regen von zu Hause aus anschauen. Ganz besonders möchte ich den Herrn Soos begrüßen, das ist der Gründer der Goldvorsorge und der Eigentümer. Herr Soos, bitte steh einmal auf. Der Herr Soos. Der Herr Soos ist nicht nur ein exzellenter Unternehmer, Entrepreneur in Sachen Gold, in Goldangelegenheiten, aber das Goldgeschäft bringt es auch mit sich, dass die Menschen über das Geldsystem aufgeklärt werden müssen. Und der Herr Soos macht hier sehr viel in der Verbindung mit Bachheimer.com, einen Finanzblog, der auch zur Aufklärung beiträgt. Und Herr Soos hat weder Kosten noch Mühen gescheut, heute um eine wirklich anständige Konferenz hier auf die Beine zu stellen, und ich möchte mich noch einmal persönlich auch herzlich bedanken für den Aufwand, den wir hier betreiben, und dass das so halbwegs gut gelungen ist. Meine Damen und Herren, jetzt muss ich mal zweite Seiten suchen. Sie alle wissen, unser Leben wurde in den letzten Jahren durch zahlreiche ungewöhnliche, aber auch ungemütliche Vorkommnisse geprägt. Aber nicht nur unser soziales Leben wurde vor enorme Herausforderungen gestellt, sondern auch unsere persönlichen Geldangelegenheiten wurden durch geopolitische Ereignisse, geldpolitische Maßnahmen in Sachen Covid-Bekämpfung, aber auch mandatswidriges Verhalten von Zentralbanken, allen voran der EZB, herausgefordert. Mit dieser Veranstaltung wollen wir die ökonomischen Dynamiken tiefer ergründen, aber auch praktische Tipps präsentieren, wie wir durch die sicher herausfordernden nächsten Jahre kommen werden. Der heutige Tag wird auch eine Herausforderung werden, deshalb möchte ich noch darauf hinweisen, wir haben zahlreiche Pausen. Sie können sich laben, wir haben genügend vorbereitet, dass Sie sich stärken können. Die Toiletten befinden sich auch rechts und links vor der Veranstaltungshalle. Und es gibt auch einen Mittagstisch, und ich möchte Sie besonders dazu auffordern, dass Sie diese Pausen auch nutzen zum Get-Together, sich kennenzulernen, weil in den nächsten Jahren werden wir sicher gute Freundschaften benötigen und diese auch pflegen müssen, um eben diese Herausforderungen zu bestehen. Das war es eigentlich jetzt schon von mir. Wir gehen gleich in medias res mit unserem ersten großkalibrigen Sprecher, nämlich mit Dr. Weiner. Weiner ist eine führende Autorität in Gold, Geld und Kreditwesen. Er hat sein Doktorat beim großen Geldtheoretiker des 20. Jahrhunderts, dem Dr. Antal Fekete, gemacht. Wir haben beide das Glück, Antal Fekete noch persönlich gekannt zu haben und mit ihm mehrere Veranstaltungen gemacht zu haben vor 10 Jahren. Leider ist er vor einigen Jahren verstorben. Als Verfechter einer rationalen Geldpolitik ist Dr. Weiner im Finanz-TV in den Vereinigten Staaten bei Peter Schiff Show und als Keynote-Speaker in Konferenzen auf der ganzen Welt unterwegs. Freuen Sie sich bitte mit mir auf seinen Vortrag unter dem Titel Zugzwang, die Federal Reserve zum Handel gezwungen. Recht herzlichen Dank.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I chose the German term, which is also used in chess, Zugzwang, because I think it characterizes where the Federal Reserve is at right now. Can somebody put my slides on the screen? There we go. So this is the title of my talk. This is how anybody can contact me. So we have a problem starting last year, which is prices are going up a lot. Consumer prices are going up. Everybody loves when asset prices are going up. Properties, shares, bonds, everybody loves when those are going up. But now those are going down and consumer prices are going up. So everybody turns to the central bank, and of course the head central bank is the Federal Reserve, and say, fix this, do something about this. So what can they do? Well, if you go outside the central bank for a moment and say, go to the government authorities, what could the government do? Well, some governments like to pass price controls. They think, okay, well, we'll just pass a law that says you cannot sell petrol for more than €1 per liter. What would happen if they were to pass that law? Anybody in the audience know what happens when you pass a price control?
Stop selling gas.
That's right, you have shortages. So another creative approach that some governments take is to ban exports. If your country happens to produce crude oil, as the United States does, they're now discussing a measure to ban exports. And that way, we have more for us, is the theory. To which I always say, look around at the desperately poor countries and the desperate measures that these desperately poor countries desperately grasp at. One of the things that they always do in places like Argentina and Venezuela and Myanmar and other places like that are desperately poor is they prohibit exports of whatever it is they produce. Now in Indonesia, I just read, they're banning the export of certain, I think, palm seed oils. Does anybody know what happens when you ban exports? That's one problem, is they can't get dollars, but it discourages investment, which causes a decrease in supply. The very thing you're trying to fix, you're trying to have more for us, and you destroy the industry that was producing. And so I think nowadays most mainstream economists know that you can't pass laws to cap the price, and you can't pass laws to prohibit exports, so they turn to the modern day mythology, the modern day fable, which is the central bank, and say to the central bank, you should somehow fix this. So how does the central bank, what is the philosophy of central banking? How does this work? So I have this picture here. Everybody familiar with Coke and Pepsi? Even though they compete, even though they are enemies, they're both the same. They're both brown water with sugar and fizz or gas. They're both the same. And they're deadly rivals. They're constantly fighting with each other. So in the world of central banking, we have two rivals to determine how central banking is supposed to be done. By the way, the idea of a free market, the idea that the individual economic actor can decide for themselves what they want, that's not on the stage at all. So what we have are the two figures. We have Friedman versus Keynes. Milton Friedman, the so-called godfather of free markets, and then we have Keynes, who was praised by Benito Mussolini as writing an excellent introduction to the economics of fascism. That was how Keynes was praised by Mussolini. Those are the two rivals. And what does that mean today in central banking? Well, one of them says we should have central banking with rules, so-called. We should say, okay, let's watch inflation. And if inflation gets to a certain point, then let's change a policy. Or let's watch unemployment. The new one that is starting to become more popular, at least in the United States. I don't know if it has as much fans in Europe, and that is targeting GDP. That the central bank should watch GDP, and then it should adjust its policy based on whether the economy is growing fast enough. Again, I put all these things in quotes because now it's a central planner making a decision that I think you have grown enough this year, I'm now going to turn down the knob. Or I don't think you've grown enough, I'm going to stimulate you this year and turn the knob up. That's what this is all about. And the Keynesian followers tend to think that we should have the central banks have discretion. That instead of rules to confine what the central banks can do, we should just give the central banks discretion to do whatever it is that they think best. Those are our two basic philosophies. And in practice, so this picture for me means false alternative, is when you're given two choices that are actually not really opposites, and the actual alternative is excluded altogether. The other false alternative that Keynesianism gives us, is everybody familiar with the Phillips curve in Keynesian economics? So the Phillips curve should have gone to the dustbin of history, the ash heap of history in the 1970s. It's this idea that you have a trade-off. You can either have inflation with low unemployment, or you can have low inflation with high unemployment, so that inflation and unemployment are a trade-off, according to the Keynesians. I have to emphasize that. And so it seems to me it's like a person being abused, and they go to one abuser who beats them with inflation, and then they say, okay, I'm tired of this. Let me go to the other abuser who now abuses them with unemployment. And they can choose anything they want as long as it's either inflation or unemployment. And that's what the conventional economics teaches us. And so now with inflation skyrocketing, the mainstream belief is that we need more unemployment to fix this. And that will bring prices down somehow. Is that necessarily true? Well, let's move on from there. So, everybody familiar with the parable of blind men touching an elephant? And each one has a different thought, different idea what the elephant is based on what he's touching. And so, I've always heard it with 3 blind men. This picture has more. But it's kind of funny to see what they all think. And none of them see the elephant for what it is. And this picture, to me, evokes how people look at central banks and what they think it does and it doesn't do, and how it works and how it doesn't work. And everybody is, at best, seeing one tiny little aspect of it and largely getting most of it wrong. So most people think of the central bank as kind of an engineer. And you have a complicated rail network. And the engineer is saying, schedule a train for here, and switch this switch over here, and send out a maintenance worker to repair the track over here, and is fine-tuning the rail network to run efficiently and smoothly. And that's their kind of mental picture of how this works. In reality, it's something much more simple than this in a way, and also less romanticized. What a central bank is, and I think I have my next slide. No, not yet. What a central bank is it is a bank with a difference, and that is it has legal privilege. That is, everybody has to use that bank's currency as if it is money, and all the other banks deposit their excess cash with the central bank. But other than that, it is a bank. And what does a bank do? Well, the bank raises capital by issuing currency, and then it invests that capital. It's supposed to invest that capital in bonds, and then ever since the last financial crisis, they've started to invest in not just government bonds, but corporate bonds, mortgages, and in some cases, in some banks, I don't know whether the Bank of Austria invests in shares, but the Swiss National Bank does. They actually buy shares of Apple and Google and all sorts of other companies. So who is depositing funds in the central bank? I don't have any euro paper notes, but I have a US $20 bill. Anybody who owns one of these is a creditor to the Fed. That is, by having this, I have extended $20 of credit to the Federal Reserve. All of the banks make deposits to the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve buys bonds. That is what the central bank does, nothing more, nothing less. Well, actually, one other thing. It dictates the interest rate on all of this stuff, and that has some very wide consequences that also are very important, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So what is the idea behind this idea of inflation as a trade-off with unemployment? How is this supposed to work? Well, the idea is that if enough people are unemployed, then you reduce demand. People who don't have a job don't buy a lot of consumer goods, not counting the modern welfare state where the government just pays them to keep on consuming, which is what it did during the COVID-19 crisis. The government just pays them anyway. But the theory is that by essentially people vote for this idea that turn to the person to your left, that person should be unemployed so that I can buy more consumer goods at lower prices. That is the essence of this idea, this Phillips curve, this idea that the central bank can make people unemployed and cause prices to go down is by reducing demand. I have a picture here. This is Jean-Baptiste Say, a French economist of the 19th century, who is very famous for saying something that is very misunderstood. But basically, supply is demand. That is, whatever it is that I produce, I bring that to the market, and then that is the means by which I can pay for or buy whatever everyone else on the market produces. So it should be obvious that if there are fewer people working, less goods are being produced. So by rendering people unemployed, we're reducing supply. What does the law of supply and demand say about what happens to prices when supply goes down? Prices go up. So this whole theory is just corrupt. It's not just wrong. The English word would be wrongful, or immoral, or corrupt, or dishonest. There's something about it that is just propaganda. And I think that if I were the tax authorities and the regulators, I'll talk about them in a little bit, I would find it very convenient that everybody, whenever I do something to cause prices to go up, I would find it convenient that everybody blames the central bank. Because as Milton Friedman said, quote, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That is, if prices are going up, it must be because of the central bank, even though that is not necessarily the case. So, do you have the expression in German, the elephant in the room? Is that an expression? It's the thing that is huge, and it should be obvious, and yet no one talks about it. We can't acknowledge the elephant. It must be over here somewhere, you know. And it becomes a very interesting political phenomenon when there's a big elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that prices are going up for non-monetary reasons. I'm very unpopular when I say this. Both the mainstream and most of the alternative economics community find this offensive. but I will say it anyway, and I will go on the rooftops and I will bellow until I'm heard with this one. And over the last several decades, we have had a constant increase in what I call useless ingredients. So if you think about baking bread, what do you need? What are the actual ingredients to bake bread? Well, you need flour, you need water, you need yeast, and you need heat. That is the basic elements. Now you might add egg, you might add all kinds of things to it. There are wonderful pastries here in Vienna. But that's the basics of bread, is those ingredients. Now what if the government comes along with the food safety regulators and said, well, you can't use just wheat, you also have to mix in, because doesn't have enough nutrition, now you have to also put in this rare and expensive flour that can only be obtained from the other side of the world. And you have to add preservatives, and you have to add, some sort of color so that it shows that you've paid your taxes on your bread, like they do in petrol. Or diesel fuel, excuse me, has a color in it that shows you paid your taxes on it for use on the road. And so they start forcing the baker to add other ingredients that are not necessary or even desired by the consumer, or even that the consumer even knows these ingredients are there in some cases. But they're forced to put it in because they have to comply with the law. The law says put this in. So suppose that the wheat and the flour and the yeast and the water and the heat costs 10 cents to produce a loaf, and they add 5 more cents of useless ingredients. They've just added 50% to the price of bread, or cost of bread anyway. Price might be a different story, but if cost is going up, price is going up, obviously. They've just increased the cost of bread by 50%. And yet this has nothing to do with the money supply, nothing to do with the central bank. In every area of our lives, there has been a constant increase in useless ingredients. In the United States, in what we call gasoline, what you call petrol, they have forced the manufacturers to add either alcohol or a chemical called MBTE, which I think is methyl buta tetraethylene, something like that. Most people don't even know it's there, and yet that adds 25 cents per gallon, something like that, in the United States. Constantly, it's like a ratchet. They keep adding more and more and more and more, and that has been going on for decades. In the United States, we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act that forces every employer to have multiple toilets, bathrooms, but they have to be extra big for wheelchairs and all kinds of other things. And not that anybody is against people with wheelchairs being able to go to the toilet, but this adds a huge amount of cost, particularly to smaller restaurants, coffee shops, etc. And this has just been going on everywhere in the economy. And so this has been driving prices up everywhere in the economy. Number two that has to be mentioned in today's context. So that's been the backdrop for a long time. That does not explain what happened to prices in 2021. That's just simply the backdrop. 2021, prices start skyrocketing, and you have to look at things that have been happening recently. And one of which is what I call green energy restrictions. That governments around the world have decided that the earth is overheating, and to fight this overheating, we're going to either ban fossil fuels, and that can be the exploration, the production, the shipment, pipelines, the power plants themselves. So I don't know what specifically in Austria, but I know in Germany they closed nuclear power plants and they closed coal power plants and became increasingly concentrated in one source of power, which is natural gas. Natural gas is much more expensive than coal. Coal is the cheapest and most reliable, but that has become politically incorrect, and so they're forced to use natural gas. We'll get to what happened to natural gas in 2022 in a minute. In the United Kingdom, for example, they passed two stupid laws, one of which prohibits production of natural gas in the United Kingdom, and the other is that it forced the power plants and heavy industry to switch from oil and coal to natural gas, which cannot be produced in the United Kingdom anymore, so they have to import it. There's a word in English called a synergistic effect, and that is sometimes 1 + 1 = 17. That the cost of banning the production of natural gas would be one thing. Independently of that, the cost of switching from natural gas to coal and oil, coal and oil to natural gas would be something else. But in combination, you get a much greater effect on prices than you would from either of those two by itself. Now, that brings us to, actually, I want to cover one other thing, and I'll come back to this. The third one is what I call trade war and tariffs. Every country in the world has now begun rediscovering all of the economic fallacies of the late 1920s and early 1930s by deciding that they are enemies with all the other countries that produce. And they want to see if they can, in American English, we would say, shoot yourself in the foot. So they start imposing taxes on imports. The United States, we started under President Trump. I mean, we've always had tariffs, but as a weapon, Trump started to propose the idea of taxing goods from China, including lumber from Canada, including whiskey from Scotland. Once the cat is out of the bag, once you start imposing tariffs, every political interest group, every domestic manufacturer of anything goes to the government and says, please, while you're at the tariff game, please add, we make these remote controls, and we don't want to import these remote controls from, I assume, China, but maybe Korea. Why don't you put a 100% tax on importing these things? So not only do we have rising tariffs, but trade war is a bigger concept than just tariffs. And it starts to get into fear that certain jurisdictions may be off limits. So the United States banned, I believe banned, the import of phones from the Chinese company Huawei. Now that's just one company. Huawei was not particularly large market share in the United States. The big market share in the United States is Apple and Samsung, by far. But it sends a message to the market, which in English we call that a chilling effect. That is, everybody else in every other related market is chilled, is cooled off a little bit, and says, wait a minute, what could happen next? And so in the entire semiconductor industry, there's been now for the last several years a movement to stop relying on anything from China and Taiwan, because Taiwan could be part of mainland China, we don't know, and then pull all of this manufacturing back into the United States. And I believe the European Union is under a similar mission to do the same thing and have more semiconductor manufacturing in Germany and Ireland and other places where they already have some. Well, if you force companies to go to their second best manufacturing jurisdiction, if you force them to abandon plan A and go to plan B, well then costs go up. So the cost of all of this onshoring, the cost of de-globalization, that is renationalizing things, everything becomes more expensive and genuinely scarcer. If you said, everything has to be made within country, then the bigger countries might feel relative advantage. What about countries like Austria? If you said all semiconductors have to be manufactured here for use here, all automobiles have to be manufactured here and so forth. Well, these are industries that rely on global scale. If they have to now build an entire industry for a relatively small population, then either you can't produce at all, or the price has to go up. Things become much scarcer. Finally, the major elephant in the room here is the lockdown response to this virus. To me, it was just breathtaking to watch every government in the world in middle of March 2020 just boom, boom, boom. First it was Italy, then it was the National Basketball Association. Does everybody know what basketball is here? It's a very popular sport in the US. I don't know if it's very popular here. National Basketball Association said we're canceling games, and then every country in the world said, okay, there's lockdown. You know, you can't go into public places, offices are closed, restaurants are closed, airports, you can't fly, and so forth. And so what does that do? Imagine that you are in the business of operating an airline or a restaurant, and suddenly they say you have to close down. So, not yet, sorry, excuse me. Just checking my own slide here to make sure I'm not speaking ahead. So what do? Well, you have to close down your capacity. You have to lay off or furlough workers. You have to sell assets if you can. You have to preserve the business. You have to stay alive. And so every industry was impacted by lockdown, and particularly shipping, trucking, and logistics got completely off balance. The ships were in the wrong locations. All kinds of things happened. Drivers were laid off. I've just read in the United Kingdom that the airline industry had laid off a huge number of workers, of course. And then when the government says, okay, we're going to unlock you now. And they picture it's like watching a movie, and you just press the pause button. And then you can go to the toilet, and you can go make some food, and you can go have a phone call, and when you come back an hour later, you press play, and the movie just starts with the next frame. And they thought the economy would work that way. But of course, everybody is paying rent, everybody's paying taxes, and so on. And so all these companies have to scramble and reorganize themselves for a much lower revenue and much lower volume. Then the government says, resume. Well, what happens? Has anybody tried to fly recently? The airports are a disaster. The airlines cannot serve the customers that they have. It's impossible. They've lost half of their workforce probably, and I suspect that they've lost the better half of their workforce. It's always, when things get ugly, it's the better people who leave and get other jobs in other industries, and the people who stay because they have to are not necessarily the ones that are hardworking or experts. So in every industry has been hit by this, and there is just simply an inability to get things done the way they used to be gotten done. And so there's a synergistic effect between these four things, between useless ingredients, green energy restrictions, trade war, and then lockdown and what I call the whiplash. So imagine you have a ship tied to the pier with a steel rope, and somehow, and the ship is pulling, or the current is pulling the ship. Well, the tension on that rope gets tighter and tighter and tighter. When it finally lets go, the rope doesn't just drop to the ground. It will take people's heads off if you're standing in the way. So that's what's happened in the world. And so now going back to the United Kingdom, where they cannot produce natural gas domestically, they have to use natural gas for everything. And they have to import it, and now importing things has become almost impossible because the shipping industry has been pushed off balance and crippled. So what happened to the price of natural gas in the UK? 10 times. Now that has a follow-on effect Does everybody know that fertilizer is produced with natural gas? Nitrogen fertilizers. So the fertilizer factories in the United Kingdom have announced they're closing. They cannot produce fertilizer and make a profit at the price of natural gas currently. Well, what depends on fertilizer? Food. Next winter, there's going to be a shortage of food in the United Kingdom, and the price of food is going to skyrocket. And everyone is going to say, it's the central bank. Fix it, please. There is a term not coined by Bachheimer.com, not coined by Zero Hedge, not coined by me or anybody in the alternative world. It comes from the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And the term is zombie. Has everybody heard of this term in respect to a corporation? It's slightly more complicated than this, but the term zombie basically means that your profits are less than your interest expense. So you have all of this debt, you must pay interest on the debt, and of course the only way to pay interest is from your profits. I mean, you could be selling a lot of goods, but if your cost of goods sold is the same as your price, you don't have any profits. You have to have a profit in order to pay interest. And what happens when profits are below interest expense? Well, the term is zombie. It reminds me from a scene in a movie called The Broken Arrow. Everybody seen that movie? The plot is that some terrorists or whatever have taken a nuclear bomb from the United States military. And somebody is explaining to, I think it was the president of the United States in the movie, "Sir, we have a broken arrow." What the hell is a broken arrow? "Well, sir, a nuclear bomb has gone missing." And he says, "I don't know what's worse, that a nuclear bomb has gone missing, or that it happens so often, you all have a term for it." So the Bank for International Settlements has a term called zombie to describe a company who is not making enough profit to pay its interest expense. And this is a very common thing. In fact, the bank, I don't have the graph here, but the Bank for International Settlements every once in a while publishes a graph showing the percentage of zombie debt as a total of all the corporate debt in the markets. And it keeps going up. Before the Fed and the other central banks started to hike interest rates, something like 20% of all of the corporate debt out there was zombie debt. It is in this environment now that the central bank thinks it is going to raise interest rates. Well, in order for a zombie to exist, by the way, these zombies are the companies that produce food and computers and everything that you rely on, clothing, fuel, everything you rely on in life are produced by companies, including zombie companies. If all of these zombie companies were to be forced into bankruptcy, that would decrease supply of everything quite a lot. A zombie only exists by courtesy of really low interest rates and a really forgiving, friendly credit market. So not only does the interest rate have to be low, obviously, but the lenders have to be very tolerant of companies that are losing money and have no hope of ever repaying it, and the creditors are lending them more. How's more? I know you can't pay it, I'm giving you more anyway. And there's a particular kind of market in which that happens. And the central banks now are deliberately going to try to hike interest rates, which is going to cause, or is causing, credit to contract because they're trying to get employment down so that they can get inflation down. So I have two pictures here of things that have to be financed in order to be produced. One symbolizing transportation. You can't buy a good in the store if somebody can't ship it from where it's made to that store. And the other one being wheat, but all the commodities are in the same boat. You can't buy bread unless somebody was able to grow wheat and then transport that wheat to the miller who grinds that wheat into flour, and then transport that flour to the baker who then bakes it into bread, and then transport that bread into the store where you buy it, unless you buy it at the bakery that the bread is actually transported somehow. And these things today are very large-scale enterprises. They're big trucking companies, big farming companies, etc., and they do it very efficiently. Very few people today work in farming, for example, and a few hundred years ago, most of the population worked in food production. We've become very efficient. But to do things at large scale requires finance. That is, the farmers have to borrow to plant their crops, and then they pay it back when they sell the crop later. That fleet of trucks, that trucking company borrows money in order to buy all those trucks and put those trucks on the road. And then they amortize, they pay back the debt over the life of the truck. Now we're talking about increasing the interest rate, which means increasing the price that these companies are going to have to pay to finance all of these goods. We just said earlier, what happens if you force an increase in cost on the companies that produce the goods that you want to buy? Well, then the price is going to go up. So the conventional theory that we're going to hike interest rates in order to cause prices to go down is exactly wrong. And so here, my personal view is that we shouldn't have central planning at all. We should have a free market. My personal view is that every time the central banks do something, it causes harm. It inflicts damage. You don't see it, it's not like dropping bombs, but it is hurtful. But here's how I would put it. If you cared only about consumer prices, and you're going to ignore all of the other harms caused by the central bank in imposing policy, you should want lower rather than higher interest rates. And over the last 40 years, interest rates have been falling, and that's why consumer prices have been, if not falling, they've been rising due to rising regulation. But consumer prices have been soft. Manufacturers have not had pricing power. Those of you old enough to remember the 1970s, remember when manufacturers had pricing power. Well, they don't anymore. Today, or at least up until COVID, they did not have pricing power. And now we're saying, let's hike the rate of interest. Well, what's going to happen is we're going to return, if they can get away with it. I don't think they can. I think there's too many zombies. I think there's too many borrowers and too much debt. And what will happen is they will begin to see defaults. And as companies start to default, that will threaten the banks. And the central banks will act to protect their crony client banks and push the interest rate back down. Just as they did, they were hiking interest rates in 2005 and 2006. And then they triggered the crisis in 2008. They will see the defaults, they will see the crisis, and reverse course is what I would predict that they're going to do. But anyways, the point being that if you want lower prices, you should want lower interest rates, not higher interest rates. But the central banks have a dilemma, and that is people demand action. Nobody is going to listen to Keith Weiner describe economics my way. Everybody has their idea of how it works, and everybody's idea is that if you want to cure inflation, the central bank should fix it by changing interest rate policy, which means rising interest rates. But if the central banks do that to any great degree, they're going to cause a crisis. On the other hand, if they don't do it, then politically, the central bank's heads will be replaced with people that are more compliant. So the central banks have a dilemma. They're in the Zugzwang position, and there is no good way out for them. So they are making small hikes. Actually, the United States Federal Reserve has been more aggressive than other central banks. The ECB announced they plan to hike interest rates in July. That's almost like you have a war and the two sides announce they plan to get together and talk about peace. We're not quite at that level yet of actually wanting to do this, but we're going to plan to do it. And I think they said that beyond that, they might hike interest rates again by 50 basis points later in the year, I think is what the ECB said. The Fed right now is very aggressively doing this. It's politics. If the head of the Fed, by the name of Jay Powell, if he didn't do this, then by some way or another, President Biden would replace him. So whatever Powell may think or not think, this is what they're going to do. This is going to cause recession. One word I want to say about recession. The way our economy has worked for the last 50 years is that it is borrow to consume. There's no such thing as a healthy economy anymore. There's boom and bust. An Austrian school economics founded by Karl Menger here at the University of Vienna, I believe. Austrian economics teaches that the boom is not healthy. The boom is when people are consuming their capital, like the prodigal son. And then the bust is when you cannot sustain it anymore, and then calamity and everybody loses their money. But the destruction is done during the boom. So we switch, going back to the false alternatives. We flip-flop back and forth between boom and bust, boom and bust. And so what recession means, Keynes said that it's animal spirits. It's when, for no reason, people irrationally decide they don't want to consume anymore. Do you know anybody who suddenly says, I don't like nice things anymore? I don't like to eat. I don't like wine. I don't like beer. I don't like to have a larger TV with a better screen. I don't want those things anymore because the animal spirits have gotten into me. Of course not. It's that credit conditions have changed, and if consumption depends on credit, consumption is feeding on borrowed money, then when the credit stops flowing, of course, you get what is called a recession. And so in the modern world, whenever the central bank is raising interest rates, then very predictably thereafter follows what people call recession. It's nothing more than the start of liquidation of all of the bad credit out there. There's a Keynesian economist by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith who coined a term, the bezel, which is related to embezzle, which is when somebody, usually a trusted fiduciary, is stealing money and putting it in his pockets. That's embezzling. And he calls this the bezel. And the bezel is basically the total value, the market value of all of the bad credit that's out there that hasn't yet been recognized as being bad credit. Well, when you're in the boom phase, the bezel becomes huge. And then in the bust phase, the bezel reduces a little bit, although the modern central banks don't allow it to really come back to reality. It contracts a little bit, and then they panic, and then they try to inflate it some more. So that's what's coming. Will that be any good for consumer prices? Probably not. There's one good news on the consumer price front, and that is I think the shipping, trucking, and logistics industries are slowly righting the ship. I think they're slowly getting things back to working again. And so I think goods will become, at least those goods that are not available or scarce because of shipping problems and supply chain problems, I think those will go away. But other than that, everything that they're talking about doing now is going to precipitate unemployment rising, obviously, and not be good at all for consumer prices. That's right, so back to here. That was it, and if anybody has any questions, happy to take questions. Okay.
So Keith, that was it. It was a little bit quickly for me.
That's right.
Thank you for your speech and for sharing your thoughts with us. Meine Damen und Herren, Sie können selbstverständlich Fragen stellen. Sie können das in Englisch tun, Sie können das in Deutsch tun. Wir haben den Übersetzer noch hier. Sie können es in Steirisch oder Vorarlbergerisch machen, das werde ich übersetzen. In der ersten Reihe hier.
The solution is we need a free market. The company is working on bringing back the gold standard by paying interest on gold and using gold to finance production. And that way every lender, every borrower can now interact uncoerced by central banks. However, that is not a mainstream idea. In the mainstream, there are no solutions. That's why Zugzwang. You have two bad choices. That is what the mainstream gives you. Anything else is outside. There's a term called the Overton window, and that is the range of acceptable opinion politically. And that range is about this wide, and within it a lot of debate, but outside that range, you're not allowed. And the idea of a free market is way off over here somewhere. That's the only solution.
Noch weitere Fragen? Bitte, Herr von Blettberg.
One stupid question that shows my ignorance is how is a president able to remove the head of the Fed when this is a private company?
So I don't agree that the Fed is a private company, but even under what I think everybody should understand is that the head of the Fed is actually nominated by the president, ratified by the Senate. It is a political appointment. The Fed's board are political appointees. Now they do supposed to serve for 4-year terms. I don't think there's necessarily a law that allows the removal in the middle of the term. However, for something that's politically big enough and important enough, let's just say they would find a way of setting aside the law or pressuring Powell to resign. If he knows what's good for him, I don't know how politics works at that level, but there's something that they could do.
And a short remark, you just mentioned that nobody is stupid enough to wish for his own destruction and for consumer goods to go down and think because he wants to live on. I actually think that there is a subconscious yawning for destruction just out of being overfed and bored.
Okay.
Weitere Fragen? Herr Golonko, bitte.
I would like to ask you, how seriously do you take this announcement by President Putin at the BRICS summit that he considers to create a reserve currency upon the basket of currencies of BRICS member states and furthermore based on commodities?
So the commodities is interesting because there's one commodity that rose above all the others to be money. I mean, historically, cattle were used as money, salt was used as money, dried fish even was used as money, seashells, wheat, and so on. There's a concept introduced by Karl Menger called marketability. And that is essentially the measure for each commodity of what loss you take to buy in and then sell out of that good based on how marketable that good is. And gold, even before it was recognized as money, was the most marketable commodity. Of course, once it is adopted as money, it becomes even more marketable than that. So if they want to talk about a basket of commodities other than gold, I would say they are repeating a historical dead end. The problem, so sometimes people talk about, well, they're going to impose a gold standard. You cannot take, so in the gold standard, it's very simple, and so much has been said about this that mistakes it. At the core of the gold standard is, I take a gold coin, deposit it in the bank, and the bank gives me a piece of paper in return. And then whenever I want, I can hand the piece of paper to the bank and get back the gold coin. So the bank, if it wants to stay alive, has to be an honest bank, and it always has to find a gold asset to invest in so that it matures into the gold coin and it can return the gold coin to the depositor. Well, that all ended a very long time ago. Today, there is no paper currency that began life as a gold deposit. So you can't just go and declare after the fact, all that paper out there is now gold-backed. It is not, in fact, gold-backed. The banking system has paper assets to back its paper liabilities. You cannot declare the paper to be gold. That would be alchemy. Alchemy didn't work. So they can't do that. Then what do they have? Well, they have Brazil, Russia, India, China. Some of those currencies have capital controls. The wealthy people in China risk their lives to evade the capital controls and bring their yuan out of the country and dump their yuan as fast as they can for dollars. So the others of those, I mean, India has a hopeless basket case currency. Brazil is certainly very corrupt. And now you have Russia, who's on the warpath. Does anybody want to become a creditor to Putin, to Xi, to Modi, or to Bolsonaro? I think, you know, they can talk if they want, but I don't think it's going to work. But that would be I could give a whole 1-hour lecture just on why the dollar is what it is and why all the other currencies could not replace it.
Weitere Fragen, bitte.
Yeah, thank you. I may have misunderstood, but you gave a lot of examples of price increases as a result of political intervention, of distortion. But are you saying that price increases are not the result of monetary expansion, and that monetary expansion is not a problem?
I certainly would not say that monetary expansion is not a problem. There are many, many problems that are caused by that. But in a falling interest rate environment, monetary expansion goes into subsidizing the producers of consumer goods. That is, the more they lower interest rates, the cheaper it is. So suppose you own a restaurant chain of hamburger restaurants, and you have a spreadsheet for the marginal restaurant, the restaurant you have not yet built, let's say right here in Belvedere. Maybe there's no hamburger restaurant of your chain. And you have the spreadsheet, and that's all your costs and all of your expected revenues, and the bottom line is red. It's not profitable, so you don't do it. And then the central bank lowers the interest rate. Interest expense is one of the big expenses in your spreadsheet. At the new lower interest rate, the bottom line turns green. And so you build that next hamburger restaurant. Excuse me. Unfortunately, so do your competitors, as do the companies who manufacture hamburger grills and soda fountain machines and glass for the windows and aluminum for the doors. Everybody sees an increased subsidy to increase production. Unless the Austrian consumer increases their appetite for hamburgers, what happens is the price of hamburgers becomes soft and it is pushed down. Now, then they have useless ingredients that push the price of hamburgers up. The result could be flat, it could be slightly up, it could be slightly down. The monetary forces are pushing prices down as long as the interest rate is falling.
Noch weitere Fragen, meine Damen und Herren? Wo? Habe ich nicht gesehen. Fragen?
Hi, good afternoon. I just want to ask a question in regards to the Basel III framework that was passed in regards to gold being weighted as a zero-risk asset. Could you explain more about that, if you know how perhaps that could be utilized for perhaps incorporating a structured debt solution for many banks which are facing major problems at the moment, where they may need collaboration with the BIS to be able to solve their internal problems with gold?
So unfortunately, Basel went in the other direction and said that gold needs, I believe it's an increase, I believe it's to 85% net stable funding ratio. So today, of course, banks' balance sheets are denominated in dollars or euros, not in gold. So to have gold as an asset, they perceive that to have some risk. And the Basel framework is designed, so the falling interest rate environment makes the banks unstable and brittle, like a glass figurine, when the whole thing shatters. So they try to compensate for this with what they call macro-prudential regulation, of which Basel III is the leading type of regulation. So they try to regulate what kinds of assets they can have, and they also try to say for each kind of asset, what kind of funding that the bank would have to own that asset. So for example, if the bank has a 30-year mortgage as their asset, they want to make sure, the regulators want to make sure that the bank has stable funding so that if you have another 2008 crisis, the bank isn't faced with a demand to return its funding, but meanwhile you can't sell the asset because 30-year mortgages are an illiquid market. What the Basel III does is it pretends that gold is illiquid and therefore forces the banks to use more expensive capital, which is long-term bonds and equity, to finance gold on the balance sheet. So it is actually forcing banks to get out of the gold business, which we've seen, and that's been a general trend over the years. Deutsche Bank got out of the business, Rothschild got out of the business, BNP Paribas, and most recently Scotia Makata. One by one, they're all leaving, not getting into it. I think there would be a lot of opportunities if the regulation allowed them to use gold to recapitalize, but unfortunately, that is not the regulatory environment that we're in.
Okay, Keith, I want to place, I take the liberty to place the last question here on your term now. I'm asking not for me, and I'm asking not for a friend, I'm asking on behalf of ECB, when will Federal Reserve stop tightening?
When will they stop tightening? This is a politically incorrect answer, but I think this is a politically incorrect audience, so that's probably okay. I think when they perceive enough defaults starting to affect their crony client banks, when JP Morgan and Citibank and Bank of America, but also Deutsche Bank, HSBC, when they start to see the defaults hitting. And that's they don't care about the stock market, they don't care about GDP, they don't care if you have a job, but they care if the banks are suddenly having losses on their loans. When that happens, the Fed is going to say, oh, bleep, just like they did in 2008, and I think they will be very aggressive in responding to the new crisis which they just created. But as to the timing of that, months to maybe a year, would be my guess. That's a guess. But
let's hope it turns out well. Meine Damen und Herren, wir machen jetzt eine kurze Pause. Keith, thank you for sharing the thoughts with us.
You're welcome.
We may have a little present for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Meine Damen und Herren, verlustieren Sie sich bitte, laben Sie sich am Buffet draußen. Das ist jetzt einmal das erste Kuchen- und Kaffeebuffet. Wenn die Musik erklingen wird, dann bitte ich Sie wieder, sich gemächlich hier einzufinden und dann den Vortrag von Professor Dr. Thorsten Polleit zu lauschen. Recht herzlichen Dank derweil. Gute Unterhaltung.